As the 20th century opened, the fortunes of the papacy seemed at an all-time low. The Pope, beleaguered and landless, a prisoner of the Vatican. Yet, spiritually, his power had grown to dizzy heights. He was infallible, a father to millions in the faith, the oracle of God. The modern world would test the papacy as never before. It would witness the rise of dictatorships more savage than any in history. What would it have to say about evil on this scale? The city of New York, built in about as many years as any medieval cathedral, but unlike them, built to the glory of Mammon. Fast, modern, leading. And yet, for all that, a Christian country where penny-a-week subscriptions helped build giant city churches. This was God's country, a republican country, free of old oppressions. From the middle of the 19th century, millions of immigrants flooded into Ellis Island. Many of them were Catholics, eager to become citizens of this vibrant modern republic. These proud new Americans brought their ancient faith to God's free country. Free men in a new world. This was the age of the common man. In 1903, St. Peter's seat was filled by a man of the same class, a peasant pope, the first for 3 centuries. Pius X was a plump, handsome parish priest who seemed set to modernize the stiff structures of the church and to reach out to the common man. His papacy was marked by practical reform. Children as young as 7 were allowed to receive the sacrament. He encouraged all Catholics to attend Mass daily. He revised the ancient code of canon law. But though a modernizer, Pius X was no modernist. A peasant by birth, by virtue of his high office, a monarch. Popes down the ages had been monarchs. Kings and emperors had kissed their feet. Empires had been born, empires had died, the papacy had survived. But was it trapped by history? Could it face the new world? Pius detested the Italian state, which had robbed the Church of its lands, and he abhorred the secular society which denied the rule of God. Victor Emmanuel's monument, designed to be taller than the dome of St. Peter's, nicknamed the wedding cake, it is a reminder of the divorce of church and state. In matters of the mind also, Pius was an authoritarian.
Theologically, he had all the peasants' distrust and hatred of ideas. Theologians were potential traitors. All these clever chaps were busy explaining away the faith. And so he slams down on theology. It's got to toe the party line.
With papal backing, a secret society was established to root out theological deviance. It spied on and harassed suspect theologians. No one was safe. Even curial cardinals found their every action watched and reported. In 1910, a ferocious anti-modernist oath was designed to winkle out error and imposed on the clergy. It remained in force into the 1960s. Pius died in 1914. It was rumoured that his successor had himself been denounced as a modernist heretic. Benedict XV was in fact a compassionate and sensitive priest, elected to be pope in a time of total war. As Catholics came face to face on the front line, he saw his role as peacemaker. He refused to take sides. At the Versailles Peace Treaty, the Allies excluded him. But for the Pope, there was no peace. The atheist Bolsheviks were on the rampage. Lenin spoke. The people revolted. The monarchies crumbled. As the last of the absolute monarchs, what did this mean for the papacy? Elected as Benedict's successor in 1922, Pius XI was convinced that communism was the worst enemy Christian Europe had ever faced. A dictatorial pope, he ruled the Vatican with an iron fist, but for the sake of the Church, he would negotiate. This was the era of concordats.
It had to do, I think, with the realization after the First World War that new states had come in which had secular governments which would no longer respect the rights of the Church. And therefore it became part of the Church's policy in dealing with these new states to make these kinds of contractual agreements.
Italy was now a fascist state. Its leader, Mussolini, saw the Pope as a valuable pawn in public relations. He offered to end the confrontation between church and state. In 1929, the Pope and the fascists came to an agreement. The Church was awarded territorial independence in the form of its own tiny sovereign state, the Vatican City. Just 1/8 of the size of New York Central Park, but with its own border restrictions. Catholicism was recognized as the majority religion of Italy. Catholic doctrine was to be taught in state schools. The crucifix reappeared in public buildings. The Pope was to receive massive financial compensation, a back payment of 1¾ billion lira for the loss of the Papal States. Pius XI hailed Mussolini as a man sent by Providence. This gigantic cross is a memorial to General Franco and to those who died supporting him in the Spanish Civil War. In his steadfast opposition to communism, the Pope welcomed the rise of right-wing regimes all over Europe. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime was a danger to the Church, but it was also anti-Bolshevik. To Pius, Hitler seemed the lesser of two evils. To protect the Church's rights, in 1933 he negotiated a Concordat. It was the first international recognition of the Nazi regime. But Hitler honored no agreements. He turned on the Church. Pius knew he must react. He issued an encyclical with burning anxiety denouncing Nazism. Written in German, it was to be read aloud from Catholic pulpits. In 1937, easier said than done.
The smuggling of the encyclical into Germany is one of the great spy stories of the period leading up to the war. It was done with maximum security. The German government was becoming alarmed. They knew something was going on, but they didn't quite know what. And to get a document as inflammatory as it in fact was into Germany, printed, disseminated right through the country, and read aloud right through Nazi control of the media was an astonishing feat and absolutely infuriated Hitler.
Increasingly horrified by Hitler's regime, Pius planned another encyclical to denounce Nazi racial theory. But he died in February 1939. He died before it could be published. This was the inheritance of Pius XII. A man who seemed born to be Pope. A man of peace. A diplomat, a negotiator. Austere and devout, he spent his first few months as Pope in a desperate effort to prevent the war. Trained by Benedict XV, he laid his trust in negotiation, but that was not enough. Groomed by Pius XI, he acted as go-between in a plot to murder Hitler, to make way for peace. That failed. He was indecisive in an age that cried for action. He was paralyzed in the face of decision. There was despair beyond tears. There were sins too great to comprehend. From Pius, there was a silence which is difficult to condone. In 1942, no one knew the extent of the Nazi genocide against the Jews, but the Vatican suspected. It received reports, logged statistics. Pressure mounted for a condemnation. At Christmas 1942, Pius spoke of the horror of thousands of people put to death because of their race. It was a typically coded message which went out that day on Vatican radio, yet Pius felt he could do no more. Was he afraid of abandoning neutrality, of an anti-Catholic backlash?
My own view is that that is probably right. That had the Pope said something in late 1942 or early 1943 condemning the extermination of the Jews, there would have been persecution of Catholics. On the other hand, I actually think it was his moral duty to do so.
One October morning in 1943, the dilemma presented itself on the Pope's doorstep. The Nazis rounded up the Jews of Rome. Jews who had lived here since the time of Peter, the Pope's own Jews. Vatican funds were poured into rescue measures, leaving the safes empty, the basilicas full. The churches offered refuge. Pius felt he had done all he could. Then came peace and the recriminations of peace. Still, Pius was silent. What does this tell us?
The question of his speaking out during the war, or not speaking out, is perhaps an imponderable. I think that to answer that question, you would have to enter into his own soul. You would have to see his conscience at work, and I just don't think that that's possible.
I think one has to bear in mind there's a whole range of elements which made it very plausible for somebody like Pius XII to be anti-Semitic. But anti-Semitic doesn't mean you're in favor of the extermination of other human beings, which is a very different kind of thing.
In 1956, Pius did speak out against tyranny, another tyranny which did persecute Catholics. Yet to remain silent, he wrote, we would have to fear God's judgment more. Pius was condemning the communist invasion of Hungary. As communists silenced the church in Eastern Europe and gained an ever larger share of the vote in Italy, the very survival of the papacy seemed in question. Pius solemnly excommunicated anyone, anywhere, who voted communist. The Western world was gripped by anti-communist fever.
Investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry must not be considered.
While American Catholics like McCarthy zealously purged the enemy from their midst, Pius retreated into a lofty solitude. There were rumors of visions, revelations. By the time of his death in October 1958, a stifling atmosphere of suspicion had descended upon the church. The conclave, which met 2 weeks later, was deeply divided. They opted for a compromise. 77-year-old Angelo Roncalli. He would not last long. He was too old to rock the boat. Human calculation has seldom been more spectacularly mistaken. Rural Italy had yielded a peasant pope at the start of the century. It now yielded another whose roots were embedded even deeper in the land. Born to Italian farmers who shared their house with 6 cows, Roncalli served as a papal diplomat in the obscurity of war-torn Bulgaria. He was no radical, chosen by Pius XII to implement his conservative policies in France. But he had a great human heart. The world awoke to find a laughing, fat old man on the throne of Peter. John XXIII knew the modern world and extended an open hand to it without fear. He was a security nightmare, sallying out of the Vatican to visit his flock, wherever they might be. At the Vatican, no more splendid isolation. John welcomed visitors, his speeches punctuated by his favorite phrases of bringing up to date and living together, phrases that had a hollow ring in a Cold War world. It was hippies who spoke of living together. The flowering youth of this period were born into a nuclear age. What relevance did an 80-year-old conservative religious leader have for them? Undaunted, he prayed for a free new world. A world where bishops, wherever they may be, shared responsibility with the Pope. Where the rich respected the rights of the poor, wherever they may be. For the fact is, he declared, that no one can be by nature superior to his fellows. Was this just utopia? John was no idle romantic. He tried to make the dream come true. Just 3 months after his election, he called a council. It was to be a meeting of the world's bishops to discuss, debate, and decide the Church's policies. To the Vatican Old Guard, the thought of letting 3,000 bishops talk to each other, even have new ideas, was horrifying. To John, it was the only way forward. This council had to open up the Church. There were to be no condemnations, no excommunications, but a desire to build a relationship with society at every level. John certainly had a vision of a pastoral, unified church celebrating a vibrant liturgy, but he had no clear agenda. He relied on the more progressive of his cardinals to guide the sessions. No longer an isolated monarch, this pope listened to his bishops. The ancient faith would be reclothed in ways and words which would speak afresh to a world hungry for the gospel. As the council progressed, John's life ebbed away in cancer. He died on June the 3rd, 1963, the most beloved pope in history. In the council, his legacy lived on. But under whose guidance would it live? Was there another giant with the same visionary dream? As a cardinal, Giovanni Montini was instrumental in formulating the council's agenda. John's right-hand man, he was the obvious choice. That choice was taken. Now, as Pope, Paul VI faced an awesome responsibility. His first act was typically even-handed, allowing himself to be crowned, then selling the papal tiara for money for the poor. And still the council, now Paul's council, debated.
There were people who were hoping, often very unrealistically, for a total transformation of Christianity, and others who were determined that they would die in the last ditch defending it the way it was. And it looked to very many people as if the Catholic Church would simply break apart. And it was part of his genius that he was trusted by both sides, and he managed to hold both sides together.
But Paul's methods could be maddening. Each liberal gesture was matched with a conservative one. He earned the nickname Hamlet. Yet, steadily, he pushed the essential changes forwards. And with the last session of the Council in 1965, emerged a transformed Catholic Church, a truly universal church. The Mass was translated. The sacrament received in the name of Christ and in the language of the people. But could the Council unite Christ's Church? After centuries of hostility, Paul and the Patriarch of Constantinople lifted the age-old mutual excommunication of each other's churches in an eloquent gesture. The Jews were no longer to be held responsible for the death of Christ. All men had the right to worship according to their consciences. The Church had long since realized it would have to tolerate religious liberty in a modern world. Now the Council decreed they ought to. But what of the forgotten underclass of the Third World? Paul published encyclicals on social justice. He was hailed as a champion of the poor. He traveled the world, encouraging the people. In all this, he was faithful to the Council, but equally committed to the papacy. These conflicting loyalties were to dominate his later years. In keeping with the Council's desire to relate papal authority to that of other bishops, Paul set up a synod to meet regularly and advise him, an extension of the Council, in principle.
In practice, however, he was afraid of relaxing his own authority. He felt there were some issues where the buck stopped with him. So in the end, the synods tended to become talking shops with the agenda decided by the Vatican.
Yet Paul infuriated the old guard by introducing a compulsory retirement age of 75 for bishops and denying cardinals over 80 a vote in papal elections. His sense of isolation was to grow. A new generation weren't making war, they were making love. The sexual revolution was turning old values on their head. A revolution which was to affect most in the liberating age. Contraception became a real issue for Catholics. In the face of social pressure, Paul took an unprecedented step. He removed the topic from discussion at the Council and set up a special commission to prepare a report. It recommended changing the teaching to allow artificial birth control in certain circumstances. Paul could not.
He'd held to the old teaching because he felt to change it would shatter the Church's authority. Exactly the opposite happened. I don't know what the equivalent of this situation of people voting with their feet is, but Catholics all over Europe refused to accept the teaching, all over Europe, all over America, and even in the Third World.
Those who embraced the faith could not embrace a teaching which seemed so at odds with the society in which they lived. In droves, they left. In modern America, many priests left too. By today, their numbers have halved. Their average age, 65.
Rappresento Gesù e allora tutti vengono, non per me, ma per Gesù.
Paul never doubted he had done what had to be done, but his confidence was shattered. His last years as Pope were a sort of slow crucifixion for him as he agonized over his own unpopularity, the mass exodus of priests from the church, and the growing violence of the secular world. He died in 1978, his simple coffin stripped bare of regalia, a symbol of one of the greatest but most troubled pontificates of modern times. His successor was John Paul I, a simple, good-humoured bishop chosen to lift the gloom that had descended during Paul's last years.
Anche il Papa è stato alunno di queste
Some
scuole.
doubted he had the stamina to be Pope,
Liceo,
but there was no
università.
time to find out.
Ma io
He was found dead in the papal apartments just a month after his election.
alla gioventù e alla parrocchia.
Unfortunately, the Vatican engaged in a rather silly cover-up. The Pope's housekeeper, a nun, had in fact brought him coffee that morning in bed, and that's how she discovered him. But of course, being in the Vatican, celibate priests and so forth, they weren't allowed to give out the idea that a nun would go into a Pope's bedroom, so they said it was the secretary. Somebody else thought up the idea that he was reading a holy book, The Imitation of Christ, and this was found in his hands. And as a result of this, when these little white lies were discovered, this gave rise to the notion that there was a huge cover-up.
Sensational rumours circulated. The Pope had been murdered, silenced before he could expose corruption in the Vatican Bank or change the teaching on birth control.
But when you think about it, this is extraordinarily illogical, because it's almost like saying, you should cut off your grandmother's head because she's got a pimple on her nose. So all the indications are he stopped his medicines and he died of an embolism about 3 weeks after that occurred.
But why stop the medication? Was this a conscious decision? Surely not. On his election, John Paul had attended to his post immediately, as was customary. He never returned to Venice to pack his suitcase or his medicines. Nobody noticed. His unexpected death shocked the world. The cardinals had elected a simple, good man, and the Lord had whisked him away. Was there a message in all this? General opinion called for another pastoral pope. But who? The 261st successor of Peter, the inheritor of the longest unbroken dynasty in the world, John Paul II. A Polish pope, the first non-Italian in 400 years, bishop of bishops, the vicar of Christ. He is a paradox, populist, charismatic, a champion of human rights and religious liberty, yet ultra-orthodox and conservative. A man convinced of his supremacy, chosen by God. The Pope must suffer, he said. He truly has. A childhood laced with tragedy, the death of his mother and brother, the political rape of his beloved Poland, first by the Nazis, then the communists. During the war, he labored in a quarry and chemical factory. He became acquainted with horror. He was a poet, a playwright, a philosopher, and then a priest, training in secret to serve a church which suffered in silence. In time, it was to cry freedom. In 1979, Karl Wojtyla returned to Poland as John Paul II. This was the greeting of a country which, under communist rule, was officially atheist.
Within minutes, the Pope was going through the streets of Warsaw, being acclaimed by a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people. You could see that the communists had no idea that this was going to happen. They were completely taken aback, and that first mass he held in the Victory Square in Warsaw was a complete triumph. You knew at that moment that profound changes were going to take place.
With the moral and, some say, financial support of the papacy, democracy triumphed in Poland. It helped trigger anti-communist revolt throughout Eastern Europe. A liberating church then? Not always. In the 1980s, radical priests in Latin America were assassinated, martyred in the defense of the poor against oppressive governments. This was liberation theology. It got little papal support. Ironically, John Paul II is opposed to the direct participation of priests in politics. Haunted by his experience of communism, he remains deeply suspicious of what he sees as Marxism dressed up as Catholic ideals. And in Latin America, his word carries huge weight.
Pater Sancte, Deus Patrum Nostrorum,
Rome, a mass for the family. John Paul preaches to a Western Catholic nation with the lowest birth rate in the world. No contraception, no abortion. In family matters, God's will must prevail. The same message reaches the Catholics of the Third World. Contraception is intrinsically evil. Yet, when self-perpetuating poverty and AIDS threaten the most vulnerable in society, many find it hard to believe this is God's will.
Pietro lo confessò con la parola e con sangue, figlio del Dio vivente.
John Paul has no doubts. Controversy will rage. His word must be trusted and taken to heart. Catholics look to a pope who has dedicated books, plays and poems to the celebration of womanhood, yet who rejects the notion of a woman's right to choose. In 1995, he declared the debate about the ordination of women closed. There was no debate. Christ chose only men as apostles. Only men may be priests. It is a stern, paternalistic vision. On other issues, the Pope's attitude is liberal and outreaching. Fascinated by Judaism, he became the first Pope to visit the synagogue in Rome, and has initiated shared acts of worship with many other faiths. As a Slav, he looks to the Christian East to bridge the hostility between the Catholics and Orthodox, which he believes has left the Church breathing with one lung.
So our prayer, our desire, our effort must be to go back to the unity of the first millennium as we approach the third one.
Paradoxically, it is John Paul's exalted vision of the Pope as a supreme bishop which is a major stumbling block in the quest for unity.
As the successor of the Apostle Peter, whom Jesus Christ placed over his church, I have a binding duty to encourage and strengthen the faith of my brothers and sisters wherever they are.
A missionary pope of titanic energy, veteran of 70 international tours, John Paul has gone to the people. And the people have come to him. Millions crowded into Rizal Park in Manila in 1995 just to catch a glimpse. His energy and unique charisma bring out the faithful like football fans.
He has seen himself as bishop of all the Catholic churches throughout the world. Now, at one level, that's enormously appealing. Crowds turn out in their tens and hundreds of thousands to see him. People want to touch him and be touched by him. He has great rapport with the people. But at another level, that's profoundly disabling for the local churches, because he becomes the bishop.
Bishops' meetings and episcopal synods set up by Paul VI to advise the Pope are no longer talking shops, but apparently one-way conversations. The agenda, set by the Vatican, discussed by the bishops, summed up by the Pope.
Nei giorni immediatamente successivi alla Pentecoste.
Is the Bishop of Rome a first among equals? Is he duty-bound to listen to their views? The answer may be simple. The Church is not a democracy. But can the press be gagged? On becoming Pope, John Paul claimed that the Vatican should be as transparent as glass. Yet, in all synod debates, the press are excluded. Communication through the media is carefully controlled.
Qui, la Radio Vaticana. Laudetur Jesus Christus. Ici Radio Vatican, émission de langue française. Laudetur Jesus Christus. Alabado sea Jesucristo.
I note a tendency in recent years which I deplore. That's to say that the information services of the Vatican have been taken over very largely by the Opus Dei, this very powerful movement within the Roman Catholic Church, which has special status now. And it means to say that the control of information is much more severe than it used to be.
Specific Vatican departments process all information. On the Pope's instructions, curial officials are banned from talking to the press, on or off the record. Public relations are manipulated. Still, opinion is divided. Denounced as oppressor of women, acclaimed as God's reply to the Second Vatican Council.
Il principio della collegialità dei vescovi, come è stato votato dal Concilio.
How does John Paul see himself? He believes he is central to God's providential ordering of the world. It is not a matter of common human pride. To him, the post is greater than the man. The assassination attempt, 1981. John Paul believes that the shot which nearly killed him was miraculously deflected. It was not time for the next conclave. Not yet. But that time will come.
The 2 weeks which elapses between the funeral of the pontiff and the election of his successor is a period of great lobbying. All the cardinals arrive in Rome, and don't forget that this time you're going to have an extraordinary number of old cardinals who at the age of 80 are disqualified from taking part in the election, but be sure they're going to make their influence felt.
The Pope is the only bishop in the Catholic Church exempt from compulsory retirement. He will die in his post. Officially, the Vatican forbids speculation, yet there is already talk of his successor.
At one level, I would like a pope who, in a sense, was weaker, less popular, less in touch, and who would therefore either force or permit other people to take on a proper adult role. In the real world, however, the papacy is often a lifeline as well as a proactive ruler.
In the light of 20th century history, it is doubtful whether a less authoritative pope could have played the same part in the collapse of communism. On the brink of a new millennium, John Paul II is convinced he has a providential mission to lead the Church into the 21st century. Today, 900 million Catholics, 1/5 of the world's population, look to him as their spiritual leader. As science endows humanity with godlike powers of manipulation, our ethical values are being and will be challenged as never before. Within the Catholic Church itself, there are tensions to be resolved, calls for less hierarchy, more dialogue. A papacy which has survived the Roman Empire, the Reformation, the French and Communist revolutions, will be with us to face the future. Only time will reveal which direction in their long walk through history the heirs of St. Peter will take.